Welcome back to the next lecture where we will now finally start building our OmniFood project. And we're going to start with the hero section. And for that, I already created this sketch here. So as I mentioned before, we will create this layout where we have the hero image on the right side and then the content such as the headline and some description on the left side. So exactly like these two examples that I have selected from our layout gallery lecture. Now on top of this section, there is kind of this logo and the navigation bar, but this is something that we will do a bit later. So it's actually not part of the hero itself, but it's kind of part of the start, so of the beginning of the website. And so that's why I put it here as well. Now also, we will add this small component that I have highlighted in red here in the bottom, which is these customer photos and then with some relevant data. So that was not in the sketch before, but now here I have it, and you will see that it makes sense with the content that we have. Okay, and so now let's actually start building this hero section in VS Code. And let's start by removing what we did previously. Okay. And now I want to show you a very nice and important trick, which basically will allow us to have the HTML and the CSS files opened at the same time, side by side. So to do that, I will open again the CSS file, and then I can click here on this icon. So this one that says Split Editor Right. Now, if you cannot see it, you can also do the same thing here in View and then Editor Layout. So you can then choose one of these options here, but usually I just click here and then that will open this exact same file here on the right side. Okay, then I can close it here, and then to give ourselves some more space, we close down the sidebar, and that's it. So here we usually need more space for the HTML, and yeah, I think that's perfect. And so now we can basically work on both files at the same time. All right, but now about our actual hero section here, let's indeed use a section element, which basically represents a generic part of any document. So let's use section here and then give it the class of section hero. So I usually like to give all my sections then a class name which also starts with section. So that then makes it easy to identify, right? So we talked about section, so the section element before, and it is a little bit similar to the article element, but the article is more self-contained, basically. So for a section to exist, there should usually be multiple sections which are then part of something bigger, all right? So let's then, well, let's move that in later. For now, let's actually keep going. And so now I want to create the two boxes which will then contain on the right side the image and on the left side the text content. So let's create a div element for that, which remember is simply like a box which has no semantic meaning at all. So I'm going to call this one the hero text box, and that is the one that will contain, among other elements, this h1 here. And then we also want the hero image box. So hero image box, and then we can immediately actually put the image in here. So that is in the folder img, then slash, and then it is our hero image. Now you see that it worked because it's already right here. Okay, but now let's keep going and add some more content here. So our content, of course, is here in the MD file. So this is the one that we already have, so the headline. And then here is this summary, basically. So let's just copy all this text. Then I'm going to call this one the hero description. And there we go. Here let's also add a class for heading primary. Okay, because then later we will have some classes also for the secondary and the tertiary headings. So the H2 and the H3 elements. And of course, we could simply select the H1 using this H1 element selector, right? But actually I like to always select all the elements using classes. So no ID selectors and no element selectors. Everything will always be selected using classes because that will give our CSS code a lot more consistency. Okay, so we have the heading, then we have the description, and now we also want 2 buttons here below this. So just like in that layout pattern example that we saw at the beginning of this lecture. And for that, I'm actually going to use an anchor element. So a link, basically, because links are for going somewhere on the page or going to some other page, while a button element should only be used for actions. So if something happens that is not related to navigation, basically. So here for now, we will create an empty link. Okay. And then let's see if in the content we have some text to put on the button, but actually there is nothing. And so these types of small text, so just a small piece of text, we usually call microcopy. And many times we have to come up with those as we design and build the websites ourselves. Now this button here is going to be the main call to action button of this page. And so let's now think what we could write there. So the main action that we want the user to take here is to basically subscribe to the OmniFoot subscription, right? And so here we should write something related to that. And since the focus of this company is all on like healthy eating and things like that, we can simply write here, start eating well, for example. Okay. And it could be, of course, anything similar, but it should be like a specific action. So it wouldn't be really helpful to just write here, sign up now or buy now or something like that. So that doesn't sound so nice. And so instead, we want a very specific action like this, which makes the user feel better immediately. So start eating well, I think, is a lot more compelling than like sign up now or subscribe now. Right? Then here just adding the button class. And now besides that, we want another button, which is usually like a secondary button, which is going to be a secondary button. And this is usually used for something like getting additional information. So a popular text here is simply learn more. And then we can add some arrow here as well. So using an HTML entity, and we already used R, and then I think this here, which is the right arrow. Yeah, you can see it there in the tooltip. But then we also have DR, which stands for down arrow. And again, it's visible now there in the tooltip. And so this makes a bit more sense in this case. Okay, and with this, I think we are ready to check out what we have already. And as always, the image is really big. And so remember that we need to make it flexible now. So that's one of the ingredients of responsive web design. Remember that? Then here's also the rest of the content. And so let's now start styling this a little bit, and actually starting with the layout. So putting these 2 boxes here side by side. So one with the image and one with this text. Okay. Now for doing this, I'm actually going to use CSS Grid, even though it's actually more like a one-dimensional layout. So it's really just a row, but I'm still going to use CSS Grid because it makes it really easy to have equally sized columns. And also because I like to use the same tool for layout across the entire page. And later, of course, we are going to use CSS Grid for some other layout stuff. And then, as I said, I like to just use the same thing everywhere. All right. But even if we used Flexbox instead of CSS Grid, we would still need some container element for these two boxes. So the image box and the text box, right? So that grid container could of course be this section hero here, right? But then if we were to choose this one as the container, then we couldn't create a fixed sized container like we want to, okay? So let's actually create another element here. So one that I'm going to call a hero. And if this doesn't make a lot of sense right now, it will make sense in a minute once you actually see what I'm talking about. Okay. So again, this hero here will actually be our CSS Grid container. So let's select that. And now you can see how handy it is to have these two panels here side by side, right? So display grid. And now, as I said, we will make two equally sized columns. So grid template columns, remember. And so here we just need to give them the same value. And so usually that's 1 FR and then another 1 FR. So 2 fractional units right there. And so with this, they should now be side by side. And indeed they are, but they do not have the same size, right? And the reason for that is this huge image, which is still not really flexible. So before we do anything else, let's actually fix that. And so here, let's give it a class name. So it's the hero image. Oh, and actually we need to add the alt text as well. So never forget to do that. And so here, let's say that it's a woman enjoying food, but that's not all. There's also meals in storage, container, and footballs on a table. So a really descriptive alt text here, but that's really nice for people who cannot see these images, or also remember for search engines. Yeah, and now selecting the image with the class we just gave it. All we have to do now is to give it a width of exactly 100%, because 100% will then fill the entire parent element, which is this hero image box here, which is exactly one of the two columns of the grid. And so that column will have half the size of the grid container. And so then the image, of course, will also have half the width of the container now. Okay, and if we resize this here, then you see that indeed the image does resize as well. And so it is already, at this point, a flexible image. Okay. But now let's actually do what I mentioned to be the reason why we need this hero element here, which is to give it a fixed width. Right? So remember that we used to use the width property for that. And I'm going to give it 1300 pixels. But remember from the last lecture that we will no longer use pixels now, right? And remember what instead we use? Well, we use the rem unit, which before we set one rem here to being exactly 10 pixels, right? And so here we do not want 1300 pixels, but we want 130 rem, right? So that's one thing that we needed to fix here. And the other one is actually this width property, because what happens like this. And let's actually give it some background color here. So just some random color here. And so now let's decrease this a little bit. And well, just as I mentioned in the last lecture, now of course, this element does not adjust to the viewport. so to its parent element. And so therefore, we then create these vertical scroll bars, which is of course not what we envision for a real-world website. And so indeed, what we want is max width, right? And so now when the element is larger than the container, it will simply occupy 100% of it. And so you see that this starts to look quite nice, right? So quite real world, at least. And so then once it becomes larger than the specified width, then it simply stays here. Okay. Let's get rid of this. And then of course, we also want to center it in the viewport. And for that, we're actually going to use our old trick of margin 0 auto. Okay. And so this is starting to look like a usable layout that we can now improve upon. And so let's do that next and take a small break now.